talking about Dashiell Hammett, a writer from the 20s and 30s who is more or less synonymous with the private eye, a genre of detective fiction that really started to emerge, partly because of Hammett, out of earlier forms of detective fiction in the 1920s. Uh, Hammett was a sort of jack of all trades kind of fella, and at some point, hit on writing as a career. There was an enormous demand for printed material in the 20s and 30s, and it was sort of a reasonable like career that you could imagine, just sitting down to choose. Like they paid okay. There were just tons of magazines of all sorts, and Hammett had actually been a private detective in San Francisco, and drew on his experience to sort of craft his tales. The main things that he brought at the time, the sort of the pulp stuff that he was writing for, tended to privilege action and sort of a simple, breezy storytelling style with a lot of implausibility and romance. The main thing that he brought to the story that hadn't been as common before was, I hesitate to say realism. Some very implausible things happen in his stories, but maybe a fairly realistic attitude towards these things. A sort of a bare bones, stripped down attitude, so that even when really, really unlikely things happen, people's reactions to them are generally emotionally plausible. There isn't that kind of high romantic style of the popular literature of the day. His detective characters, there were two or three that he developed over his writing life, which actually was not that long. He started writing in the mid 1920s, and he had basically stopped writing by the late 1930s. He made a good living, and he sold some stuff to movies, and he sort of had continuing income from those sources, and just kind of stopped. Most of the stories and books that he's known for came out in just a few years, from 1930 to 1934. So he brought a little bit of emotional realism to the stories. The other thing he brought in for the detectives that he worked with, the main one by far, is the character called the Continental Op, who was the detective character he worked on. He was an operative for the Continental Detective Agency, and the stories were told first person from his point of view. He wrote a lot of short stories from this character's point of view, as well as two novels. He also created the character of Sam Spade for the Maltese Falcon, which is probably his best piece of long writing, his best novel. He wrote a novel called The Glass Key, which also features a standalone, not really a detective character, but kind of a fixer who does some detecting in the course of the book. And he wrote The Thin Man, which featured Nick and Nora Charles. And they, all of these books were successful, and all have been adapted for the movies or for radio. And he was respected in his day as a writer, and he made a good living at it for a while. Then I think he drank a lot. Anyway, what he brought to his fiction, besides this emotional realism, and this, he brought the first person attitude into the detective story very strongly. The first person position, is very engaging. The reader is trapped in that that character's point of view, especially with the Continental Op, and with the, the Thin Man. You are in this person's point of view, and you can only interact with the story through how they see it, and so a lot of the interest of the story is, what is this character's point of view? What is their attitude towards things? And the the characters he created, I'm thinking especially of the Continental Op here, are very they are very downbeat. They are not. They do not have elaborate interests. They do not carry the kind of like weight of knowledge around with them as, say, Sherlock Holmes or the Thinking Machine, and they don't pretend to understand everything. They are generally driven on the job by, it's their job. They're kind of neutral about it. They're kind of world weary. They don't expect a lot from people. They are willing to. They are not surprised when people fail basic morality, and they are willing to, imagine just about anybody being potentially being the culprit of whatever case they're working on. I think it's in the second Continental Op novel, one character asks him, they're going over the case again, and one character asks him, like, do we have to talk about this again? And the guy just says, that's the only way you do it. You talk and you talk and you talk and you think about it until it falls into shape and you see the next thing to do. And that kind of fits his character's main motive. They're not really motivated by the money. There's certainly no glamour in their work. They're just kind of, trying to do a difficult job as best they can, and motivated generally by the sense that's that's simply the appropriate thing for them to do. They don't have any high expectations for like any societal good that'll come out of, catching a murderer, for example. They are simply moved to do it. And Sam Spade, in particular, in The Maltese Falcon, is famously even more cynical than that. At the end of the book, which is very well written, just pulls you along, even though it's kind of an implausible tale. It just pulls you along from one sequence to the next. It's very stripped down. There's nothing extra. You can read the whole thing very quickly. And at the end, he's talking to this one character, and makes it quite clear that he's going to deliver them to law enforcement, to the police, not because he particularly disapproves of what they did, or thinks they're a bad person. They're no threat to him personally. Simply, it's because he has to protect his job. He has to protect his position in this community, and he can do that only as long as the police see him as a general ally. And if they ever found out, that he had the chance to bring this person in and didn't, it could threaten his ability to do his job. So he's very, it's pretty cynical. It's pretty economic. It's pretty worldly, and it's a major piece of what grew into sort of the general genre of sort of noir, and this kind of what I think eventually started to get called hard-boiled detective. His characters are very hard-boiled. They're sardonic. They are unreachable. They're not bribable by money or romance or friendship. They are sort of driven to do the job, and there is a fascination to characters like that who are sort of stripped of all the normal human relations. They don't have families. Nora Charles, Nick's wife, is a sort of attempt at that, but although she's developed much more in the movie series, she's barely in the books. The book, I should say, the single book, it's pretty much all about Nick Charles, and Nora just appears now and then and hands him a martini. But they're very closed off, isolated people, and because they are detectives, they have a cause. They can enter all sorts of social situations in their society in the course of doing their work, which is very convenient for a fiction writer when you need to have a reason for your character to interact with others. Investigating a crime is one of those sort of all-purpose motives that allow your character to interact with just about any other without any requirement for any other elaborate reason why these two might be meeting. Hammett did the action really well. He did it well by describing it simply and not overplaying it. So, there is an action in all his stories. Sometimes there is, and sometimes there's a lot, because every now and then I think he was sort of like, maybe just trying to get better paid, or maybe his editors were telling him more action, more action. Supposedly one of his stories, Nightmare Town, which is one of the long ones, he wrote kind of like as a challenge to his editors, so that it's just more or less non-stop action. It's one of those, a stranger comes to a town and everything there is rotten kind of stories, and it's just so much fighting and conflict. And in one of his books, Red Harvest, it's like similarly the Continental Op comes to this town where, like, in the course of investigating this one thing, he like runs into all this other corrupt stuff going on and decides to try to sort of like resolve all of it. That one's really, really over the top. But when the action does happen, he describes it well and simply and not too floridly by the standards of the fiction of his day. And, I think that had its attractions and became something that the people who sort of follow in his footsteps tried to imitate, because it is the most effective way to present, action, violent scenes in fiction, is to describe things simply. The details are best left to the reader's imagination. This has nothing to do with Dashiell Hammett, but just as an example, in The Lord of the Rings, which has a number of combat scenes, it's notable how in the books they are described very quickly and very briefly, and so the specifics of the fights are take place in your mind, which is better than long passages describing it. Now, if you can think of a long action sequence with many steps, that's great, and you can describe each of those, and it can wind up being like this kind of long, complicated scene with lots of like tension and character choices and drama. Then that's great, and go for that by all means. One writer who always stood out for me as far as that goes is C.S. Forrester, who wrote mostly nautical adventures, and was quite good at developing a very long, dozens of pages long, kind of like adventurous action scene where he keeps you aware of all the potential dangers that are happening and all the risks involved. And if you can do that well, but it's rare in fiction from my point of view. It's rare to see all that handled so well without going way over the top and also reducing the risk, the turning it into melodrama where you're pretty certain that of what's going to occur, reducing the sort of the fictional pleasure of finding out what's happening next. So Hammett creates this stripped down universe, hard-boiled detective, simply well described action, and the uses the first person quite a bit, where we live in the detective's point of view of the story, and we learn about their attitudes towards things by like sort of the questions they ask and the attitudes they have to other characters. And the writer who most follows up on this and becomes known for following up on it, and said in print multiple times that Hammett was his main influence in his writing, was Raymond Chandler.